Okay. Good morning, friends. It's really good to see everyone and to be together this morning with the help of technology. It's fun to see that folks are there live in person in the library and that we can gather in both of these ways. I had the great joy of introducing our special guest speaker for today. So thanks, Steve, for inviting me to do this. I'm delighted to introduce Amanda Tyler, who is the executive director of BJC, which, as you all know by now, is the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. It's based here in Washington, D.C., and I understand it's the only national faith-based group focused solely on protecting religious freedom for all. And Amanda leads BJC as it upholds the historic Baptist commitment to religious liberty, which she's going to be telling us more about. BJC does this in a lot of different ways through litigation strategy, like filing Supreme Court briefs, legislative advocacy, congressional testimony, interfaith collaboration, public education through podcasts, and campaigns like their Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. And I just wanted to mention that this is one of the very first campaigns that my organization, Justice Revival, embraced and endorsed. And as many of you know, Justice Revival is in a similar way advancing Christian support for the ideal of universal human rights. And I understand religious nationalism to really be the antithesis of a religious commitment to universal rights. I would even say on reflection that part of our impetus in forming Justice Revival was, if not to resist, certainly to offer an alternative to the Christian nationalist voices that we've just heard much more about over the last 5 or 6 years. So back to BJC and then back to Amanda. BJC, I believe, plays a crucial role in our current political moment in offering a distinctively Christian voice that's not only welcoming and inclusive of the rights of people of other religious traditions, but determined to defend those rights, those important rights of freedom of conscience and belief, which are important civil rights, constitutional rights, and human rights. It struck me that we're nearing Thanksgiving, and with all the ambivalence that we might sort of have as we consider that holiday, it is interesting that the facet of America's origin story that our country has grabbed hold on, the Pilgrims, were people who came here seeking religious freedom and seeking space to live according to their beliefs. And so we're sort of in a time of year when we reflect on that history. And then I want to tell you a little more, and I know these are just the highlights of Amanda's accomplishments. She is co-hosting right now the Respecting Religion series on the BJC podcast. So you can subscribe to that. I just did. Amanda is often speaking to national media on issues of religious freedom. So we already heard that Michael had read a piece about her work in the Washington Post. She was named Baptist of the Year by ethicsdaily.com in 2019 for her work on the Christians Against Christian Nationalism initiative. And she's been called a powerful advocate and rising star by the nonprofit Times, where she was named one of the top 50 nonprofit leaders in 2018. She holds degrees from Georgetown and from the University of Texas School of Law. And then this is just my own commentary. I see Amanda as the go-to thought leader on the critical issue of religious freedom and how we as people of faith can respond to the threat that Christian nationalism poses. So we're incredibly grateful and fortunate, Amanda, to have you with us this morning to talk about the threat posed by Christian nationalism.
Oh, Allison, thank you so much for that really gracious introduction. And thanks, Michael, for recommending me, and Steve for inviting me to be with the class this morning. So, my plan, I have a presentation to share with you that should take around 30 minutes, maybe a little less than that. And I'll run through that. And then I want to spend the rest of the time just in conversation and answering questions. So, I won't be monitoring the chat or anything while I'm presenting, but then after I'll stop sharing the screen and then we can just have questions and conversation. So, if questions come up as I'm presenting, please jot them down because we will definitely get to those. So I am going to share my screen. Can you all see that? Because now I can't see you, but hopefully you can all see that.
You're good. Go with
Okay,
the.
great. Fantastic. Okay. Just to tell you a little, and I'm going to use some QR codes during the presentation just because I can't do things in the chat. But if you have a phone and want to grab any of these QR codes, you can go. This is just one where you could sign up to get some more information about BJC. As Allison mentioned, BJC is an advocacy and education organization based here in Washington, but serving the whole country. We've been around for 86 years, and we are carrying on the Baptist distinctive of standing up for everyone's religious freedom. Uh, Depending on how much you know about Baptists or where that information is coming from, that might be surprising to you. But we Baptists trace our roots back to the early 17th century. And from our beginnings, the founder of the Baptist movement was someone who wrote the first defense of universal religious freedom in the English language. We also claim Roger Williams, who, of course, founded the First Baptist Church in America and was a stalwart defender of religious freedom. So we at BJC are very much consider ourselves the heirs to this tradition, and we stand up for everyone's religious freedom out of a theological calling of ours, as well as the call for Jesus that Jesus gave us to love our neighbors as ourselves causes us to stand up for the religious freedom of our neighbors as we would our own, no matter what their faith tradition might be, or even if they choose a faith tradition at all, because we understand that our opportunity to say yes to God is meaningless if we don't also have the opportunity to say no to God. And so we stand up for our non religious neighbors and their religious freedom as well. The other information on this screen is just how to keep up with BJC on social media, how to follow me on Twitter as long as Twitter still exists, and hope that you will look up these resources to learn more about BJC. Well, as Allison mentioned, over the last several years, our public advocacy has been concentrated on our campaign, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And that's because we believe that Christian nationalism is the single biggest threat to religious freedom for all today. And because of that, and because we think that a recommitment to the foundational ideas of religious freedom for all is the best way to counter Christian nationalism, we find this work to be squarely within our very focused mission on advocating for everyone's religious freedom. So I always start with definitions because I think that it's very important that we have a common vocabulary about what we're talking about when it comes to Christian nationalism. This QR code will take you directly to the Christians Against Christian Nationalism website, which is christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. The centerpiece of the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign is a statement of unifying principles. And in that statement, this is how we define Christian nationalism. We define it as a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities. It suggests that to be a true American, in quotes, that one must be Christian and one must hold certain beliefs politically that align with political values and have a certain interpretation of the Bible. There are several markers of Christian nationalism that help us recognize it. First, Christian nationalism relies heavily on this mythological history of the founding of the United States as a quote unquote Christian nation. And when people use this term in this way, they're not talking about America as a Christian nation in a demographic sense, because I think it is fair to say that throughout our history that a majority of Americans have identified as Christian in some way. But rather, this idea of the founding, that the country was founded by Christians based on Christian values in order, or sometimes now called Judeo Christian values, in order to privilege Christianity. And, this first of all contradicts the history of the founding and the constitutional text itself. After all, the founders made a very deliberate choice in breaking politically from England to also break with the established the custom at the time, which was established religion. This was something that did not work well for the American colonies, and therefore the new government specifically disestablished religion in the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. The only place that religion or religious is mentioned in the original Constitution is in Article 6 and its prohibition against religious tests for public office. And I often point to this particular fact as one that is the best counter to the Christian nation myth. After all, our founders were brilliant people who set up the country. If they wanted to set up a Christian nation, one, they could have been explicit about that in the Constitution, which they weren't. But two, they wouldn't have banned religious tests for public office. There's no way to have a Christian nation if you don't have a way to tell whether your rulers, your governors, the people who are in office are religious and or Christian particularly. So this Christian nation myth belies the history and the constitutional text. But also, for those of us who are Christians, it also violates our theological understanding of of God's love for the entire world. John 3:16, a text that many of us memorized as children. For God so loved the world, not God so loved the United States. But Christian nationalism is an exaggerated form of American exceptionalism that emphasizes God's providential hand guiding America through history and in present politics. This idea that God has a special mission for the United States in his view of the world. This contradicts theology that God loves all of God's creation equally, not Americans over other people. I do think, as we're talking about what Christian nationalism is, it's also important to distinguish what Christian nationalism is not. And so I want to draw a line between Christian nationalism and Christianity. First of all, as I defined earlier, Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework, whereas Christianity is a religion. Christian nationalism is not a religion. But the cultural framework part of that definition means that Christian nationalism is a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems. And so because it uses the language and symbols of Christianity, it can be very confusing in the public audience and can be easily confused with the religion of Christianity. But the Christian in Christian nationalism is much more about an ethno-national identity than it is about religion. And specifically, that Christian carries with it all kinds of coded assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. Christian nationalism is doing a lot of work in coded identity politics, and that is part of this Christian nationalism definition. That said, I am drawing a distinction between the two, but I think it is not accurate to say that there is nothing similar between Christian nationalism and Christianity. And that's because Christian nationalism as a political ideology, as a cultural framework, has been around the country since the founding and even before the founding. This idea that God has a special role for America has been running along in our society this entire time. And so, therefore, Christianity itself, American Christianity itself, has been impacted by Christian nationalism. And in some religious communities today, Christian nationalism has so infected Christianity and their practice of Christianity that it can be difficult to tell the difference between the two. So there is a distinction, but it is not always very clear where the line is between the two. I also want to distinguish between Christian nationalism and patriotism. And in conversations with people about Christian nationalism, they often refer to something like, well, what's wrong with being a patriot? To which I answer nothing. But let's be sure that we understand where how we're defining these terms. I think of patriotism as a love of country, and we can express that patriotism in a number of different ways. We can hang a American flag outside of our house. We can say the Pledge of Allegiance. We can choose not to say the Pledge of Allegiance. We can take a knee during the anthem. We can protest. We can protect religious freedom rights of our neighbors. We can vote and help others to vote. Those are all ways of showing patriotism. Nationalism, on the other hand, is this allegiance to country that demands supremacy over all over other allegiances. It of course, says that our country is more important and better than other countries in the world, but it also demands that when our theological convictions come in conflict with what the country demands, that we choose country over theology. And that is when our patriotism bleeds into nationalism and what we are trying to fight against. But I think when we are fighting Christian nationalism, it's very important that we continue to say that one can be patriotic and a faithful Christian at the same time without bleeding into Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism as a as an ideology is something that has been in recent years studied by sociologists of religion. And this information that I'm sharing with you now comes from the two people who I think are the leading scholars and researchers who are working on Christian nationalism right now. And those are Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. They wrote a book in 2020 called Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, which I highly recommend as a very readable text to understand Christian nationalism. And their methodology for studying Christian nationalism was a survey accompanied with individual interviews. And in the survey, how they identified for Christian nationalism, they don't ask people, are you a Christian nationalist or not? Instead, they give a series of statements and ask respondents how much they agree or disagree with statements like these. The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, that the success of the United States is part of God's plan, that the federal government should advocate Christian values. And then, based on how respondents answered these questions, they plotted Christian nationalism along a scale of orientations, from rejecting on one end to being full on ambassadors on the other end. And then in between, being a resistor of Christian nationalism or an accommodator of Christian nationalism. And I think, and again, these figures are from their 2020 book. Um, but I think three important points about these orientations. One, understanding Christian nationalism is thinking about it as a scale, as an ideology that impacts us all. As Samuel Perry has said, it is not a diagnosis. It's not you're either a Christian nationalist or you're not, but rather, somewhat like racism, it's understanding how an ideology that permeates our culture, that has been part of our culture since the beginning, how much we either embrace or reject that ideology can help us dismantle it. Two, I think this is an encouraging point, The smallest section of society, according to their research, is this full-on ambassadors of Christian nationalism orientation, less than 20%. I- On the other hand, it is discouraging that 1 in 5 Americans fully embrace Christian nationalism, as we talk more about how dangerous of an ideology that is. But it is still a distinct minority. But a majority, nearly 60%, are in the middle. They're either resistors or accommodators. That's the bottom section of this pie chart. And I think the point to take from this is we all have work to do. This is not something about just identifying this minority section and concentrating all of our attention on those ambassadors, but rather thinking about how Christian nationalism is impacting us even in our own communities, our own churches, um, and their research shows that this is something that is across the country, that is in every denomination, that is in every ethnic and racial group as well, all across ages. The how much someone embraces it or rejects it varies among those groups, but you have people in all four categories in every segment of the country. And so this is something that really is all of our work to do to dismantle Christian nationalism. Ed, I do want to talk about white Christian nationalism. You may have noticed throughout that I've used the term Christian nationalism particularly, but we talk about white Christian nationalism at Christians Against Christian Nationalism in this way, that Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. I don't think that Christian nationalism is exactly the same thing as white supremacy, but they run along the same tracks. That's because Christian nationalism creates and perpetuates a sense of cultural belonging that is limited to the people who were included in the founding of the United States at the time of the founding, namely native born white Christians. And this idea that others are second class citizens is kind of baked in to an understanding of Christian nationalism. Of course, the Christian nation myth, this glorified and fictionalized accounting of the founding, also has to include slavery. And so, in doing so, it implicitly imbues God's favor on slavery, on racial violence, on segregation. And so the language of just Christian nationalism is often much more coded than explicitly racist language, but that means it can be even more difficult to identify and to dismantle the racism that's baked into Christian nationalism. And we're seeing this play out across the country in fights at the local level about schools teaching about slavery, about racism. And in some states, we're seeing civics education that is focused on teaching the Christian nation myth. And so we see that in some communities they are much more comfortable with teaching this myth of a Christian nation than a more candid assessment of American history. So now that we have just some definitions, I want to talk about how we can spot Christian nationalism in the culture. Sometimes it is incredibly obvious, as it was at the January 6th insurrection. This QR code will take you to a report that BJC published along with the Freedom from Religion Foundation, that I believe is the single most extensive accounting of how Christian nationalism influenced the January 6th insurrection. This report has been widely read by the public, has been reported on, and has also um, been sent to the January 6th committee. And in fact, the committee requested that Christians Against Christian Nationalism submit an expert statement on the topic to their work. And so we're waiting to see how this work might be included in the final report of the committee that we know that they're working on right now. And the report says that you can't understand that, Christian nationalism alone can't explain what happened on January 6th, but you can't understand what happened on January 6th without understanding Christian nationalism. And that's because it worked to unite this disparate group of actors and embolden them by turning their political cause into a religious cause, that God wanted them to attack the Capitol. And this shows up in deadly violence, not just at the Capitol, but we've seen it in the hands of violent extremists at places like Mother Emanuel AME Church, at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, at the El Paso Walmart, at the Top supermarket in Buffalo. That there are many, far too many examples of how Christian nationalism works to inspire deadly violence against our neighbors. And so we must learn to understand and recognize that. But we can't stop there. There are other instances of Christian nationalism. And I want to talk specifically this morning in this Sunday school context of how Christian nationalism can also work to distort Christianity and harm our Christian faith in the country. So I want to. So this on the left, you all probably are familiar with this. This is called the Peace Cross or the Bladensburg Cross. It's in Bladensburg, Maryland. It's a 40-foot cross that's on government land, and a legal dispute about this cross went all the way to the Supreme Court a few years ago when the American Humanist Association challenged the government's upkeep of this cross as a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And I don't want to talk specifically about the facts of the case here. The court ended up upholding the constitutionality of this cross, but really limiting it to its facts. And the BJC, with some other groups, filed a friend of the court brief in this case. And our brief, we have filed in nearly every church state case since 1947. We are often helping to explain how the two religion clauses of the First Amendment, the no establishment and the free exercise clause, work together to protect everyone's religious freedom. In this case, though, we had much less law and much more theology. And that's because the the government and those who were supporting the government's cause in this case were so anxious to uphold the constitutionality of this cross that they were making the argument that the cross is not a religious symbol. I'm going to say that again. They were making the argument that the cross is not a religious symbol. Well, what is it then? They were saying it was just a generic symbol of sacrifice, that this was meant to stand for all war dead. This cross was erected to commemorate the members of the local community who had died in World War One. But they said that this cross it stood for anyone who died, not just Christians. And BJC and those who filed with us, we filed a brief explaining the theology of the cross, explaining why it is the central symbol of our faith, and also explaining for why to us as Christians it was deeply offensive for the government to suggest that it had no theological meaning. We also had Jewish groups who were on our brief with us who explained why it was deeply offensive to them for the government to argue that the cross had no religious meaning, and that the cross would somehow stand for Jewish dead as equally as it would for those who were Christians who had died in the war. And fortunately, the court did not go as far as the government's argument in this case. They did acknowledge the theological significance of the cross. But I point out this example as a cautionary tale of what can happen when the government appropriates religious symbols for political aim. And I've made this presentation many times, and recently, in a response to my presentation, an African American minister made the comment, this isn't the first time that the cross has been appropriated. And he talked about how the Ku Klux Klan, who used Christian nationalism combined with racism and anti Semitism to enact terror on the country, and specifically on Black and Jewish Americans for many years, how they appropriated the religious meaning of the cross in order to justify their hatred and their violence. And so it's important, I think, as we think about the impact of Christian nationalism, what it does to our symbols, how it distorts Christianity, sometimes beyond recognition. I also, to go from a very dramatic example to a more everyday example, sometimes at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, we want to ask people to reflect on how Christian nationalism might be showing up in their own congregations. And this is a very familiar picture to many people when you have the American flag, sometimes with the Christian flag, placed right up there on the altar. And I think it suggests the question, what exactly are we worshiping here? What does the American flag have to do with our worship of God? What kind of signal are we sending about where our allegiances are? How is this distracting us from the reason that we are in the sanctuary to worship God? And so the point of this slide and of this conversation that we're trying to have at Christians Against Christian Nationalism is just to ask the questions, to question some of the assumptions that maybe have gone unquestioned for far too long, that have allowed Christian nationalism, this again, this idea that to be Christian is to be American, to be American is to be Christian, how that has infiltrated even our own worship practice and our own theology. At Christians Against Christian Nationalism, I mentioned earlier, there's this central statement of principles that we hope can help unify disparate Christians, people who differ on theology and ideology and even politics, but how we can come together to oppose Christian nationalism. And there are 8 different principles of things that we think we can all agree on, to help us oppose Christian nationalism. And I wanted to highlight this one, and it's specifically about the threat to Christianity of Christian nationalism. We put it this way, that conflating religious authority with political authority is idolatrous and often leads to the oppression of minority and other marginalized groups, as well as the spiritual impoverishment of religion. It leads to idolatry because Christian nationalism conflates state and religion. And the nationalism, as we talked about earlier, causes us to elevate our political allegiance over our duties owed to God. In other words, Christian nationalism causes us to worship a false idol of power, replacing the central message of Christianity, of course, which is the gospel of love, the the idea that we love our neighbor, we love the least of these, we care for those that are oppressed, we take care of them. And Christian nationalism elevates power over those theological imperatives. On the spiritual impoverishment of religion, Christian nationalism shrinks Christianity, shrinks Jesus, shrinks God into a box that can be controlled by the state. In my work at on Christian nationalism, when we launched this project in 2019, I hosted a 10-part podcast series. And one of the episodes was a conversation I had with renowned scholar Walter Brueggemann. It was a fantastic conversation with him. And he talked in that podcast about how Christian nationalism creates a very anemic God. This idea that it creates a God that is weak and that can be controlled by the state, can be understood by the state, can be molded into whatever the state's aims are. And I want to just share with you just one line, which I just found so beautiful from that conversation I had with Dr. Brueggemann. He talks about, again, the central idea of the cross and the crucifixion and resurrection narrative that is so central to our faith. He said, what the crucifixion resurrection narrative bears witness to is that the presumption of any nation or any empire has its limits and finally cannot defeat God's intention for an alternative way in the world. The confession of Easter is pivotal for political practice in the world because it says that God's will for life and for well being finally is the truth of the world. And when we sign on for that, we sign on for all kinds of possibility that the nation or the empire does not want to entertain. Dr. Brueggemann is really calling us to the power of our faith and how powerful that is as we stand up for justice in the world, and how the nation and the empire doesn't want that. How Christian nationalism is trying to control that ultimate justice that comes from our calling as Christians. So I really recommend that conversation to you. So as we close, I go to the questions and answer. I just did want to again urge you all to go to Christians Against Christian Nationalism. The QR code is here on this screen. There you can join us as a Christian Against Christian Nationalism by adding your name to as one who endorses that central statement. But then also you can find so many other resources. You can find the podcast series that I mentioned, along with a discussion guide if this group or another group wants to go deeper. We also have a 3-part um, curriculum that you could do over 3 Sundays that includes clips to webinars that we've produced, one-pager documents, explainers, and lots of other information that we are continuing to add to, and would just love to have your partnership at Christians Against Christian Nationalism. So I'm going to stop sharing. Hopefully that worked. All right. I couldn't see you all at all while I was presenting, so I was really hoping that it all went off without a hitch.
We could see you.
Good.
There's so much to chew on in here. It's hard to know where to start. And with this group, I'm sure that there will be people who have good questions. Let me start off with one, and that is, what is the view of the Baptist Joint Committee on a series of recent Supreme Court decisions that have held essentially that people can hold their religious viewpoints to the point where they impinge on vulnerable or marginalized groups? I'm thinking of cases like the baker who would not make a wedding cake for a gay couple, and the high school coach who had voluntary prayers for his players, which when you look at them are anything but voluntary at the fringes of a high school football game.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you our position specifically on those 2 cases, and I'll also talk just more generally about how we view our Supreme Court advocacy. Um, so our general view is the only way that you protect everyone's religious freedom is by an expansive idea of the Establishment Clause and an expansive idea of the Free Exercise Clause. Okay, but those will at times come into conflict. And so, but you have to understand how those 2 clauses work together. And what's I find very troubling about the recent direction of the Supreme Court is they have an incredibly expansive idea of free exercise, particularly when it comes to Christian claims at the Supreme Court. And they have absolutely no regard for the Establishment Clause. And if you lose regard for the Establishment Clause, then you lose religious freedom for all. So at what is masquerading as pro-religious freedom cases are actually anything but, because they don't understand the role that the Establishment Clause plays in protecting everyone's religious freedom in a pluralistic society. So in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case from several years ago, which the court decided not to decide essentially, and is kind of still pending in many ways. We filed on behalf of the state of Colorado in that case, not on the Baker side, because we talked about how the civil rights law there was a compelling government interest, and how there was no way we look for ways to accommodate religious free exercise claims whenever we can, but there was no way to accommodate his claim in a public accommodations standpoint, which is what his business open to the public was, without also impeding all kinds of other claims, including an interracial couple that might come to get his services, a interfaith couple if he didn't believe in that, how those would harm religious freedom. And so we sided with the state in that case. And the recent case out of state of Washington, the football prayer case, we also sided with the school district in that case, because what we interpreted was happening in the full context of that case was state sponsored and state led prayer in the public schools, because the football coach was an agent of the state in that case, and that we said to protect religious freedom, parents should be able to send their kids to school and to the football game and to play on the football team without being indoctrinated by the state into someone else's religion. And so we talk much more about this on Respecting Religion. We did like 3 episodes on my podcast last year about this very topic. And on our website, you can see where we come out on all kinds of different cases like that.
Diane, and then Allison, and then Alvin.
And Michael had his hand up too.
Okay. So I was putting into chat what I was thinking. I guess some of my thinking was that the mid 20th century, a number of the theologians in that time period came out strongly against nationalism and saying that nationalism was not compatible with Christianity. And it seems like their teachings are very applicable today as much as they were 75 years ago. I'm just thinking that, you spoke about Dr. Brueggemann and his writings and thoughts, and I'm just wondering, do some of the other theologians of that time period, how do they inform the thinking, and how can we use them to counteract some of this thought that's going on, this rise of Christian nationalism?
It's an excellent point, Diane. And I think this is really, when we think about where we're going next with Christians Against Christian Nationalism, one of the topics that we're really going to focus on is understanding, how Christian nationalism distorts Christianity at even a deeper level, and engaging theologians, modern theologians, but also engaging theologians of the past, and helping with materials to help people understand that, both in the churches, but also in the broader culture. And, I would point to one of our partners at Christians Against Christian Nationalism is Rob Schenck, who is actually in the news a little bit now for some other reasons, but he runs something called the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute. And he talks very passionately about how Dietrich Bonhoeffer was someone, of course, who lost his life at speaking power to the state and fighting nationalism and fighting Nazism in particular. But how that kind of theological understanding can help us battle what we're facing now. I think it's an excellent point, and something we will certainly be tapping into more deeply.
Thank you.
Allie?
I found your presentation so illuminating. The question I wanted to ask is about something I've noticed on Twitter recently. So the sociologists you mentioned, Whitehead and Perry, I've noticed them talking about this interesting way that some people are now really leaning into this Christian nationalist identity. And they seem to be surprised. It sounds like a few years ago, people were like, what? Christian nationalism? No such thing. And now they're like, oh, yes, of course, we're all for it. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that. And also curious whether you ever have a chance to address groups that do embrace that identity. Do you ever have that chance? Does it ever make sense to speak to that kind of the folks that just are really at that end of the spectrum? Do you ever see them converting away from that? Kind of like Rob Schenck's second conversion, I guess.
Yeah. Fantastic point. And yes, so earlier we really saw a huge shift in the conversation around Christian nationalism this summer, and it started really with Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I think was certainly the first office holder to openly embrace the Christian nationalist label. Because when we started this campaign in 2019, the response we got specifically, I recall from the Family Research Council, was you're making this up. There's no such thing as Christian nationalism, and you're calling us names, and you're just trying to silence us from the public square. That was kind of the usual response from those who were most embracing Christian nationalism. Now, keep in mind, we didn't single anyone out. So it's kind of telling that they're the ones who said, you're calling us names. So you're, like, I certainly didn't name Family Research Council as anyone that we were focused on, but they very quickly picked up on the topic. But Marjorie Taylor Greene earlier this year said, I'm going to say it proudly. I think we should all say it proudly. I'm a Christian nationalist. The Republican Party should be the party of Christian nationalism. She started selling T-shirts that say "Proud Christian Nationalist," and then we saw others adopting the same language. And what we didn't see is a repudiation from leadership, from Republican leadership of the term. And so I have mixed feelings about this. On one hand, it is easier to fight something when they at least acknowledge that this thing exists, right? But then in the next phrase, she goes back to conflating Christian nationalism and Christianity. She's like, what's wrong? What's wrong with being a patriot? What's wrong with being a Christian, right? And so she's confusing the term there. But what I'm most concerned about is if we don't have pushback, we're going to normalize Christian nationalism. This idea that this is something that not only are we proud to own it, but it's something that we should aspire to. And there's a lot of recent polling out recently, which is very mixed. And Holly Holman, our general counsel at BJC, and I talk about on our podcast, Respecting Religion. We break down some of these polls and kind of what to make of them. But I think what it shows is really that there is that 20% of American society that both, you know, identifies as Christian nationalist in some way, even if they don't use that term, and wants the country to be a Christian nation, that wants the country to have Christian laws, that doesn't really care about other, views and other traditions. And that's incredibly concerning. But it also means that there's a special onus on the other 80% to push back from that, right? And to be more active. And so that's why I think that what we need to do is talk more about Christian nationalism. We can't fight it if we don't name it. And there's another recent poll that said over half of Americans, 54%, had never heard of Christian nationalism before. So even though I was shocked by that because I'm in these conversations all the time, and we've seen a huge uptick in media coverage of it, but still, I think it isn't really penetrating. And I think it's important, just like racism, understanding and dismantling racism, that we have to understand Christian nationalism in order to work to dismantle it. And so we need more education, we need more clarity on all those terms. I feel like I lost another thread to your question, Allison, but hopefully I covered.
But I mean, you covered so much. I guess the only other piece was, do you ever have an audience of those folks who identify as Christian nationalists?
Yeah, that's hard. And I think what we I think that those people are best reached by people they already are in personal relationship with. And so a lot of our work at building a network around Christians Against Christian Nationalism, which we're currently at 30,000, and we're trying to build that out even larger, but that those 30,000 people do have relationships with people who are most impacted by Christian nationalism. We're trying to resource Christians Against Christian Nationalism to go and have those conversations with their family members, with the people in their church, because that's how we're really going to change it. That sometimes is I think an unsatisfactory response, you know, to some people of like, but it's the way that we're going to change this is really conversation by conversation. And so we're trying to build the network of people who are able to have those conversations with the people that they love and are in community with. And I think that's how we're going to change it. Me going to make a presentation to them is less likely to be heard and received.
Alvin?
Yes, thank you. In my personal opinion, the reputation of the United States has really suffered a lot around the world in the last few years. And I'm wondering whether Christian nationalism is a part of that, or do you see it as more an internal problem for our country still?
Well, I would say Christian nationalism is a worldwide problem, religious nationalism in general, but what we're seeing now, it is, especially with what's happening in Italy, in Hungary, and Brazil. We're seeing how the religious nationalism and Christian nationalism is kind of feeding on each other, right? So I would point to, for instance, the CPAC conference as one where that has hosted leaders like Meloni from Italy and Viktor Orban from Hungary, that they come and share the stage here. And then you have, you know, when Georgia Meloni was elected in Italy, you had Tucker Carlson on Fox talking about how wouldn't it be great if we had a leader like that here in America. So I think they're kind of feeding on each other a little bit. And, you know, depending on the country, depending on the audience, some people love the rise of Christian nationalism in the United States, and others don't. But I think as we fight Christian nationalism, you know, there is a way for us to tap into, you know, patriotic pride in the way that our country was set up to disestablish religion. How we our founders, and as imperfect as they were and all that they got wrong in the founding documents, this is one place where they got, I think, very right, was this at least ideal of religious freedom that we're called to. And so I do think that kind of that's a way for us to tap into that patriotism and American pride in a way that could make us, you know, something that to build respect in the world, at least in the non-fascist world that we're trying to do. But the rise of fascism worldwide is something it's incredibly concerning. Michael, yeah.
Yeah, I just before we go here, I went to law school a long time before you, back in the days of, you know, woolly mammoths and mastodons and great sloths. But it's really remarkable, the sea change that we've undergone in constitutional law. And I remember my constitutional law professor giving us this sort of formula for how to determine whether a statute or an ordinance violated the Constitution, and that was whether it was equally offensive to confirmed atheists and zealous believers. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that I think that was a wonderful formulation, and yet we're going in exactly the opposite direction. I think that World War II was probably the high watermark for this sort of religious pluralism and tolerance and appreciation for the non-establishment of religion, and that we've gone in the opposite direction every year since.
Yeah, I agree. There's one more hand up, I see.
Carl.
Yeah, good morning. Carl Klontz here. I want to commend you on the talk. Fantastic, mind-opening talk. What I come out of your talk is a great concern that, you know, the rise of Christian nationalism comes at a time when global authoritarianism is accelerating. And along with that global authoritarianism, we are seeing belligerence in foreign policy. I mean, look no further than Ukraine and Taiwan, perhaps. And as an infectious disease epidemiologist, I cannot escape the similarities between a pandemic and the rise of Christian nationalism. You know, it's like a microbe. It spreads quickly. People's behavior facilitated. And we almost need an international body such as WHO to deal with the rise of authoritarianism and belligerence. And I'm wondering, is there any such group internationally that can cohesively take on this kind of thing?
It's a great point. I don't know of one, but what we're trying to do and is build partnerships. I mean, I think that you are absolutely right about the danger of Christian nationalism, the pervasiveness of it. I talk about it as a poison, and that religious freedom for all is the antidote. And those are the ways that we can neutralize Christian nationalism. But we are all about building these partnerships because the problem is so much bigger than one group, than one country. And what really gratifies me, people a lot of times I'll get a question on a panel or something, what gives you hope, because it's kind of a downer of a topic, right? But I say, I what we've seen is people really concerned about it. What we've seen is interest in the topic and a commitment to doing something about it only grow the more people that we're able to present and understand this. And we saw that happen right after the insurrection. We'd been doing our work then about 18 months, but the insurrection brought people to the topic of Christian nationalism, wanting to understand it. And then we saw it again when Marjorie Taylor Greene and others started talking about it. We saw people standing up and saying, what can I do about this? And so I think that we are building that international and national network of concern, and you all are part of it. So I guess I know we're getting close to our time, but just really encourage you all to join us at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and commend you for your excellent questions and conversation here today. I really enjoyed being with you.
Thank you so much. This is very much of a piece of a number of talks that we've had recently. One that strikes me that we had recently was a talk on empathic listening and how to listen to somebody and to understand somebody whose views you disagree with intensely. It seems that we don't do that, and on this topic at least, we don't know how to do that. We're very much siloed. You can't you can't talk to Christian nationalists on MSNBC, and you can't talk to those who believe in religious pluralism and a diverse society on Fox News. And I'm wondering, beyond working that individual network, are there other ways that we can do this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, cable news is certainly a huge problem with polarization on all fronts, and I think that I do think that that's why Christians Against Christian Nationalism, our work is mostly done in communities and congregations, and getting people, that's one place where at least during the service and during the time together, the news isn't on, but I think part of what we're talking about in having these conversations is a sense of humility and self-understanding about understanding how Christian nationalism might have influenced our own theology at different points in time. How, recognizing how Christian privilege is actually quite rampant in our society. We have these ideals of religious freedom for all, but in so much of how we operate as a society, it really does privilege Christians. And to kind of internalize that a little bit and approach each other with a sense of, I used to think that, or I grew up hearing that Christian nation myth, and then I looked into it, just to kind of understand. I think that can be somewhat helpful in breaking down walls between people, is to kind of understand how we all are people first before political label. And that's somewhat countercultural, right? In
Yeah.
how we're living right now. So, um, all of this is hard. I want to. None of this is a quick fix. This is all quite painstaking and long, hard work. But I think that for the health of our democracy, but also the health of our faith and our authentic Christian witness, that it's really necessary work. So commend you.
There may be an opportunity to address this coming up at a large dinner table on Thursday.
Exactly. Check out our resources. We even did an episode on respecting religion, I think last season, about how to talk to your friends and family about Christian nationalism. So go ahead and listen to that if you need a little a little pep talk before Thanksgiving dinner.
A couple of quick notes about next week. We will not have adult education next week, but Pastor Denise will be leading the walk through the labyrinth, which is an annual tradition, at 9:30. It's a short walk designed for contemplation. The only thing that will stop us is really bad weather. So I hope people will plan to attend and follow Pastor Denise through the labyrinth next Sunday morning. And 2 weeks from now, Carol Starr will be leading a discussion on the beginning of Advent. Carol, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Just basically, we'll be looking at different avenues for the challenges of finding the light and hope during this Advent season. So we'll be looking at different resources and paths, and really living the courage of our convictions that will give us all hope as a community. So we invite everyone to join with that. And I can't thank Amanda enough for really leading this prelude to that. I just joined your network and really appreciate what you're doing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for your attendance. Thank you all for your really interesting questions this week, as usual. It's a blessing to have this hour together on Sunday mornings, because it's such a good way to wake up and get some intellectual stimulation and see some old friends. And we thank you, and everybody will see you on the live stream in 10 minutes. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda.